Good morning, Isaac.
Good morning, Matthew.
How are you today?
Oh, I'm good. How are you doing?
Super. Deborah Shields is going to be necessarily absent this morning, so I'm going to be sharing my screen and advancing the slides. Just thought I'd maybe do a quick test.
Sure. Do you want me to make you the meeting host so you can launch the poll as well?
Yes, please.
I know Deborah said last week she wasn't able to launch the poll while she had the slides displayed, I think. So, but that might have just been.
All right, well, I think we can test both of them here. I will test first the screen share and then the poll.
All right, yeah, you are host now. So I did just see your screen for a second, so I think that was working, but you should also now be able to try the poll.
So there you see the GridWorks slide.
I do.
Excellent, thank you. And then here comes the poll. Launch. Is that showing up on your screen?
Yep.
Great.
And I just submitted an answer, so it should show you 1-5 over there.
Excellent, it did. And now I'm going to share the results. Is that working?
Yep, I can see that as well.
Excellent. All right, well, hopefully it goes that smoothly later as well.
Is that still the only question you need for today?
Yes, sir. We're just going to use that one question.
Great. Well, yeah, and now that you're a host, when anyone else joins, if you want to make them co-host as a backup, you should be able to do that.
Okay.
If for some reason your connection were to drop, it should revert host back to me if you don't assign another co-host. So I'll stay connected throughout the meeting just as kind of a backup. But I think you should be able to do everything you need at this point.
All right. Thanks very much. Appreciate your help, Isaac.
No problem.
Good morning.
Good morning, Amanda. How you doing?
I'm well. I just learned an old work friend of mine passed away. Very sad.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he's a good guy. We had a lot of fun together. Matthew, the Lisa's presentation is not embedded in the other presentation.
That's correct. So I'll just switch between the two.
Okay, sounds good.
Isaac, if you're there, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
Is there a backup phone number we could use to access this Zoom line? The presenter is a little concerned that they might lose internet. They'd like to have a backup plan.
Yeah. If you is it someone who I have an email for? I could send that to them. Or
why don't you just send it to me or drop it in the chat bar and I'll pass it over to her.
okay, yeah, I can just put it in the chat then.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see that part of the invite.
Huh, that's a bit odd. I think if I recall correctly, I think Deb might have sent out the invite. So
She did. She did. Yep.
That might have just been omitted because it's usually better to have people on video, or it might have been, I might have not sent it to her in the first place, but I'm putting it in the chat right now. So there's a bunch of different numbers that Zoom provides. They all work, but sometimes the same, but sometimes you'll call one and it'll be busy. So I included them all just to have a few backups. And then the meeting ID and passcode that it'll ask for are at the end of that message.
Thanks, Isaac. We'll make sure they're included on the future invitations. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Amanda.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Glad to have you on board.
Thank you.
And did you get the phone number?
I did. Thank you. I just, there's squirrels in this neighborhood.
Yeah. I live in Flagstaff, and whenever it's windy, the internet is just bad. And I'm thinking, like, isn't internet underground? But for some reason, when it's windy, it's not as good.
No, the lines are all above ground.
Oh,
I mean,
are they?
in my area. I didn't know you lived there. We were there. We went to Sedona in December, and we went for a day to Flagstaff. It was very cold and snowing.
Well, yeah, 7,000 feet. Gosh, I wish I'd known that. Next time, we'll know.
Yeah, I wish I had known.
Yeah.
I assume we're in a green room.
No.
Oh, well, now people know where I was in December.
It's okay. It's okay. We'll get started in a couple minutes.
Sure. I'm going to step away from just a sec.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Good morning, everyone. Amanda Orman with GridWorks. If you would add your affiliation to your name, that would be very helpful, and we'll get started in about 1 minute. Okay, we might have critical mass. I'm sure we're going to bring on other people as we go. Morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Ormond. I am a senior fellow with GridWorks. Joining me from GridWorks is Matthew Tisdale, our executive director, as well as Jeff Ackerman, who's also a senior fellow. Good morning, Vice Chairman Hall. So
Good morning.
We're in webinar number 2 of a series of 10 that we're hosting with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission to look at grid modernization. For you, those of you that weren't able to join the last webinar, we have all the materials posted on the gridworks.org website. We have a video of the whole presentations, and we have notes from what we captured from the discussions. Today, we're going to be talking about integrated planning for the distribution system. And so, Matthew, if you want to go ahead and share the screen, that would be great. I see most of you have added your affiliation to your names, but if you haven't, that would be great if you could. So today's objective, we really want to do 2 things. We want to push information out to you. We want to talk to you about what is best practice around integrated distribution level planning. But then the second part of the whole conversation is to gather your input about components that can be used by the Public Regulation Commission to build a notice of proposed rulemakings. So that's what we hope to accomplish today. With the agenda, we're going to do what we're going to do throughout this webinar series. We are going to have an expert present to you a significant amount of information. We're going to have a short period of qualifying questions. Then we're going to move into facilitated conversation where it's your time to share with us what you're thinking and what you heard. And we're hoping to develop a set of next steps and information that can be used by the PRC to develop the NOPR rule. So, GridWorks is, we work throughout the West on helping organizations bring people together to have facilitated conversations, to go through difficult technical issues, to help decarbonize the electricity sector. So we have Jeff Ackerman, Matthew Tisdale, and myself, Amanda Ormond, today. And then we're really, really pleased to have Lisa Schwartz as our speaker today. Many of you may know Lisa. I've had the pleasure to know her for many, many years. She is a market strategic advisor for the electricity market and policy at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Lisa's been there about 8 years. If you haven't read her stuff, you should. She works on utility regulation, electric system planning, energy efficiency, and other distributed resources. She also leads the lab report series, Future Energy Utility Regulation. Before she was at the lab, she was at the Oregon Department of Energy. She also was a senior associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project and also at the Oregon Public Utility Commission. So we are going to turn it over to Lisa to give her presentation, and then we will come back for clarifying questions and answers. So welcome, Lisa. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. And Amanda, you'll be running my slides, I believe.
Matthew, yes.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll provide a high-level overview of the integrated distribution planning process. And as Amanda mentioned, other webinars in this series will dig deeper into some of the topics I'll cover. And I don't yet see the slides.
No, they're not there yet.
Okay, great, good.
Go.
Let's go to the next one, slide 2. So first, I'll discuss distribution planning in the context of evolving power grids. And next, I'll talk about the relationship between grid modernization and distribution planning. And I'll provide an example of how one state addresses them together. I'll also place distribution planning in the context of other electricity planning processes. I'll talk about distribution planning drivers and benefits. And after that, I'll turn to state requirements and components of the plan. I provide links throughout the deck if you want to check out citations, and there's also a list of resources at the end if you'd like to learn more. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to start with evolving power grids. Next slide. So the grid was designed around large power plants located far from loads with one-way power flows, and that's changing. Distributed resources are generating and storing electricity at homes and businesses, and the grid is evolving to support the excess electricity that's flowing onto the grid. Electricity systems also are evolving to align with other changes like grid interactive end-use technologies, like grid interactive water heaters and smart thermostats. And the point is that grid operators can call on this new demand flexibility to help optimize their grid operations. Next slide, please. So what is a modern grid? U.S. Department of Energy calls on 6 characteristics: reliable, secure, affordable, flexible, sustainable, and resilient. Next slide. So from a technical perspective, the grid is characterized by 3 things: a modern grid, digital communications for exchanging information between grid assets, programmable controls for system management, and real-time situational awareness using sensors and computer-based analytics. And that's about as technical as I'm going to get today, so don't worry. Many utilities have taken steps toward grid modernization. For example, deploying advanced metering infrastructure, that's smart meters plus a 2-way communication system between customers and the utility. Distribution automation is another example. That way the utility can automatically determine the location of faults and rapidly reconfigure how electricity flows to avoid outages. And utilities are also adopting standards-based approaches to communications across all of the different functional areas. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to turn to the relationship between grid modernization and integrated distribution planning. Next slide. All right, this is an important and simple point. Grid modernization planning starts with principles, objectives, and capabilities needed. That's what should determine functionality and system requirements for the grid. So technology choices should flow from these decisions. You want to resist the temptation to pick technologies first. And holistic long-term planning for grid modernization really is needed to support, for example, state goals. If you have greenhouse gas emissions targets, you might consider, for example, advanced metering infrastructure that can enable demand flexibility so you can integrate more wind and solar at scale. Planning also is needed to address interdependent technologies and systems, and that includes so-called platform or foundational components that support other grid modernization projects. One example is an advanced distribution management system, which integrates multiple operational systems and automatically restores power after outages, and also can optimize grid performance. Through planning, you can also consider proactive grid upgrades to facilitate customer choice. For example, you might want to improve hosting capacity for solar, and you can use hosting capacity analysis to determine how much you have now. What's the additional amount of distributed resources that you could easily integrate on a given place on the distribution system? And what are the relative interconnection costs by location? Are they high? Are they low? Next slide, please. So under New Mexico law, grid modernization should facilitate integration of renewable electric generation and enhance reliability, security, demand response capability, customer service, efficiency, and conservation. And the law includes a host of technologies that could support these objectives. All of these technologies should be considered in distribution planning. At the same time, you may have other plans, and you will have other plans that feed into the distribution planning process. For example, an electrification plan may inform grid needs for electric vehicle charging. You might have a dedicated cybersecurity planning process that identifies resilience threats for the distribution system that can flow into distribution planning. And you've been doing demand side management plans for a long time. And those plans can specify the capabilities that distribution system technologies and systems should provide to achieve your multi-year targets for things like demand response and energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how one state, Minnesota, put together all of the pieces. Just like New Mexico, Minnesota passed grid modernization legislation. The bill required the largest electric utility, Xcel Energy, to submit grid mod plans to the Regulatory Commission. And the law allows the utility to request that the commission certify grid modernization projects and approve costs through a rider. Importantly, certification is a finding that the project is just consistent with the statute's requirements. It's not a determination of prudence. That's reserved for the rate case. The law also requires hosting capacity analysis and proposed upgrades to support distributed generation proactively. So the utility, Xcel Energy, began filing grid modernization plans in 2015, the same year the law was passed. And throughout the different plans, the commission has certified several of the proposed investments that they included. Next slide. So that same year that the grid modernization bill was passed, the commission opened a docket to investigate integrated distribution planning. They held stakeholder workshops. They directed the utilities to complete a questionnaire to better understand the utility's current planning processes and ways that it could be improved. The commission also requested stakeholder comments on the utility's responses. Commission staff issued a white paper where they outlined a grid modernization vision, and they proposed a phased approach so they didn't have to do everything all at once. And they also recommended guiding principles. Ultimately, in 2018, the commission set distribution planning requirements for all regulated electric utilities, both large and small, and the requirements don't differ that much, which I found interesting. Xcel Energy filed its first integrated distribution plan that year in 2018, and they filed 2 updated plans since then. I want to make one important point here that the commission now requires consolidated filing of the distribution and grid modernization plans. So they're considered all together in one proceeding. Next slide, please. So this slide puts distribution planning in the context of other electric utility planning processes. So distribution planning is focused, of course, on the local grid, and it's assessing what physical and operational changes are needed for safe and reliable service. Typically, it's an annual process with a 1 to 2 year planning horizon. And of course, utilities have been doing this since they started operation. They couldn't run the system without that. So, what we're talking about here is a filing and stakeholder engagement and commission review process that may not exist now. So the utility also has a longer term capital plan that they use to identify and budget for their identified distribution solutions. And that's typically over a 5 to 10 year period, updated every 1 to 3 years. So that's distribution planning. Integrated resource planning, as you know, identifies future investments for bulk power system needs, again, to meet reliability objectives, also public policy objectives, all at a reasonable cost. Utilities consider multiple scenarios for loads, distributed resources, and other factors, and the impacts on the need for and the timing of utility investments or purchases. And finally, there's transmission planning, which is identifying future expansion needs for the high voltage delivery system and the options for meeting those needs. Next slide, please. So through integrated planning processes, multiple load and resource scenarios are considered in a consistent way throughout the system. That includes the distribution engineering analyses that's shown in the blue shaded box, as well as resource and transmission planning analyses. And all of that informs grid modernization strategies, which in turn are considered when the utility is sourcing grid services from distributed resources through pricing, programs, and procurements. Harmonization across these processes provides consistency in utility decision-making and reduces the risk of over-procurement of resources. And I want to point out some resources here from the NARUC-NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning, which you can readily access on NARUC's website. Slide 14, please. So modernizing the grid is an outcome of distribution planning. It's not a separate goal. It's integral to and it's informed by other planning processes. So in other words, assessing the value of grid modernization technologies and capabilities it's part of how utilities plan. It's not a separate objective. Longer term distribution planning includes developing and refining a grid modernization strategy. And then there are implementation plans for grid modernization that help advance technology investments to improve reliability, operational efficiency, integration of distributed resources, and realizing their potential value. A primary focus for grid modernization plans is advanced grid technologies to replace aging infrastructure. So you have that opportunity and you want to take advantage of it if advanced technologies make sense. So that's longer term planning. Near term annual planning also informs grid modernization implementation. And all of these cyclical interactions allow for course corrections. So you can address the uncertainties that are inherent in any kind of planning, including distribution planning. Next slide, please. So grid modernization investments for the distribution system are made in the context of distribution planning and state policies, and distribution planning can reveal the most effective strategies for grid modernization to achieve the state's policy objectives. So this graph is Xcel Energy's grid modernization strategy from its most recent integrated distribution plan in Minnesota, filed November 1st. They call their initiative the Advanced Grid Intelligence and Security Initiative. And it's their long-term strategic plan to transform their distribution system by updating technologies and capabilities. And then there are a host of other plans or potential investments that they highlight in the plan to give a preview and for consideration. And those are all integrated into these foundational investments. Next slide, please. So there are several reasonable ways, several paths that you can use to evaluate the costs and benefits and the risks of grid modernization. And that's the subject of a future webinar in the series, so I'm not going to get in detail, but I do want to share this slide to further make my point about the need for integrated grid modernization planning and distribution planning, because Some grid mod investments may support bulk power resources as well as the distribution system. Grid modernization investments are often interdependent, and the benefits are really hard to isolate. And cost needs, the maturity of technologies, and all the deployment challenges do raise significant uncertainties. So multiple scenarios and including forecasts are important. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about why integrated distribution planning is kind of catching on across the country. Next slide, please. All right, so there are a variety of drivers that states are responding to that are causing them to want to make some improvements to the distribution planning process and make it transparent. First is deployment of distributed resources. That's happening regardless of, what the commission is doing or what the utility is doing. And that's because technology costs are really coming down. It's also because of state policies. Utilities and third-party providers may have new business models, things like leasing, that have helped. And consumers are interested. Some consumers, a subset of consumers are very interested. There's also an increase also because of reductions in cost in storage and microgrids and connected at the distribution level to improve reliability and resilience. And with all these new technologies and systems, we have a lot more data and better ways to analyze it, and that can help improve planning. As I mentioned, many utilities are proposing to update aging infrastructure, and distribution planning can put those proposals in a broader and longer term context. And with increasing levels of variable energy from wind and solar at utility scale, there's a greater need for grid flexibility and resources at the distribution level, like storage, demand response, and energy efficiency, targeted at the right times and the right places, can help. There's also increasing interest in operating distribution systems more efficiently. For example, conservation voltage reduction, something we've done up here in the Northwest for decades, can operate the system at tighter levels. And that can save energy, especially at end uses. And that reduces energy waste. And finally, non-wires alternatives to traditional solutions could provide net benefits to utility customers. And these alternatives use different kinds of distributed energy resources to meet a subset of system needs, instead of the utility installing or upgrading traditional assets. Next slide, please. So another reason that states are interested increasingly in distribution planning is the magnitude of expenditures on the distribution investments. So for US investor-owned electric utilities, they accounted for 32%, the largest part of capital expenditures. And that's over 46 billion projected in the year 2021, according to the Edison Electric Institute. Next slide, please. So in addition to interest in increased oversight by commissions of these expenditures, improved distribution planning can give the commission a holistic and longer-term picture of utility plans for distribution investments before they show up like onesie-twosie in a rate case. And, and then it's difficult when you're reviewing so many issues to really focus on it and put it in context. So improved planning also provides opportunities for meaningful commission and stakeholder engagement, and that can improve outcomes. And just like with integrated resource planning, distribution planning, consider uncertainty under a range of possible futures, consider all solutions to get to the level of cost and risk that the utility and commission and stakeholders deem reasonable. And finally, improved planning processes can help utility customers and third parties bring grid solutions to bear and spend their own capital, and further motivate utilities to choose solutions that are least cost and risk. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to state requirements and planning elements. Next slide. So here's an overview. I know it's hard to read. It just captures a snapshot in time. The point here is that states throughout the country do direct utilities to file distribution plans with specific requirements. And some states also require utilities to file grid modernization plans. And ideally, that's in combination with distribution plans. There are states that don't require, of course, utilities to file distribution plans, but many states do require utilities to report regularly, including at public meetings and in writing, on poor performing circuits and plans for improvement. So, in a sense, that is some form of transparency and planning that's in front of the commission and stakeholders. Next slide, please. So here are links to state requirements for distribution and grid modernization filings. These are just examples. It doesn't include every state taking these actions or every action each state is taking. But it's a lot. More than a third of US states have established requirements to file distribution plans. And several states require grid modernization plans. And yet in other states, utilities are filing grid modernization plans on their own motion because they want commission review in advance of making significant planned investments on their systems. Several states require utilities to conduct hosting capacity analysis and post that information publicly to help guide interconnection, particularly of solar. And a growing number of states require utilities to consider distributed resources as non-wires alternatives in lieu of traditional distribution investments, and also assess their value at specific locations on the grid. In the extra slides at the back of this presentation, we talk a bit about this case studies in our recent Berkeley Lab report on this. Finally, some states provide explicit guidance on how to conduct benefit cost analysis for evaluating these non-wires alternatives. The utilities may be required to file handbooks to provide transparency on the methods that they're using to calculate benefits and costs. And these frameworks are in many ways not new. They're rooted in the cost effectiveness tests we've used for decades for demand side management programs based on avoided costs. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, I've synthesized the range of substantive and procedural elements of distribution planning requirements that states set either by their legislature or the commissions themselves. State requirements, I'll start first with the substantive elements, include the stuff you'd expect, right? With the statistics on the equipment and the system components, that's sort of both the basic stuff like poles and wires and more advanced technologies. It includes metrics like SAIDI, SAFI, and CAIDI that measure duration and frequency of customer interruptions. Really important, what are the ages and conditions of all the different assets? And what's the historical spending by category? Because it's nice for the commission to be able to track where are we at and where are things going. I mean, things have been going up. So a description of the utilities planning process also is typically required, and that includes, how they're doing their load forecasting. And with distribution planning, we're focused on projected peak demand and risk analysis for overloads in different components. So ideally, the utility applies different scenarios to account for drivers of load changes, because we're not going to get the load forecast right, especially throughout the entire distribution system. We're going to have development where we didn't expect it, and development that we think is happening may not pan out. So beyond the historical load growth and weather that the utility can go by, and the known additions that their customers are making, their plans, the utilities also consider new sources of demand like electric vehicles and growth of distributed resources like solar and storage. So ultimately, the utility develops a list of their distribution assets where they think there may be overloads in the near future, and determines the level of load at risk, and then develops a mitigation plan to address all these concerns and a budget for their planned capacity projects. Not all the projects that are on the list are going to get built because of the budget. And the utility, in designing all this, takes into account the asset health, the need for system reinforcements, the need for upgrades, for capacity, for reliability, and the new systems and technologies the utility is planning for. And then the utility applies its criteria to prioritize these projects to fit the budget. And then ultimately, the selected projects are designed and constructed. Importantly, the plan also includes information on distribution system operations, and that includes the important task of vegetation management, as well as managing reliability events. Next slide, please. All right, so distributed resources are a key driver for states in requiring utilities to file distribution plans for review. So forecasting the different types and kinds and locations of distributed resources and assessing the hosting capacity of the distribution system for interconnection. That's important for distribution plans. The utility conducts their grid needs assessment, and that should include planned projects that might be suitable for non-wires alternatives using predefined suitability and screening criteria. And you'll find examples of all this in other presentations that I've given, looking at the resources at the end of these slides. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about non-wires alternatives? It could be a single large battery. That's fairly common. It could be a portfolio of distributed resources like batteries plus geographically targeted demand response and energy efficiency. These alternatives do hold promise for reducing system costs because they can leverage customer and third-party capital. They might be able to defer or avoid utility infrastructure upgrades. And you also might be able to put these solutions in place incrementally. That's a flexibility approach to uncertainty and load growth. And it might avoid large upfront costs for forecasted load that may not actually show up. So typically in this subset of cases where non-wires alternatives may be appropriate for things like load relief, reliability, resilience, the utility issues a competitive solicitation. And it's for specific system needs, specific times, specific hours of the year, and compares these bids to the planned costs of what the utility would do in the absence, and then determines whether they're cost effective. Next slide, please. So that was distributed resources as a driver. Grid modernization also is a major driver for states adopting distribution planning requirements. And typically in the distribution plan, the utility details its long-term grid modernization strategy and forecasts the associated costs. In some states, utilities may include a request for certification for major distribution modern investments, as in the Minnesota example I cited earlier. And similar to what you have with integrated resource plans that are filed in New Mexico, the action plan is a near-term roadmap for distribution capital investments, as well as operational expenses for major technologies, systems, tools, like analytical tools and activities. And there may be additional requirements that the commission or the legislature specifies. For example, wanting to understand the utility's long-term vision and why they're proposing these investments, the ways that the utility is coordinating distribution planning with other types of planning like IRPs, what was their strategy for engaging customers, and a summary of what the stakeholders had to say. And it's also typical to see proposals for pilots from the utility, for example, for time varying pricing or managed vehicle charging. Next slide, please. All right, so let's turn to procedural elements of distribution plans. So typically utilities have to file a distribution plan every year or every 2 years. In Oregon, my state, utilities will file the next distribution plan 2 years after the commission takes action on the previous plan. And that's analogous with how we do IRPs, because a commission could take 9 months, right? And so if it's every 2 years and they haven't gotten feedback yet, that may not be in sync. So that's a consideration. Some states allow more time for filings. For example, Nevada requires utilities to file what they call a distributed resources plan as part of the utility's IRP. So the filing frequency is the same as the IRP, 3 years. So another factor for how frequently the utility should file the plan is aligning with the utility's capital planning process. Other considerations include workload, both for the utility and the commission, and a filing frequency that helps make and track progress on goals and objectives. So with respect to the planning horizon, typically the near-term action plan covers the first 3 to 5 years of the plan, pretty similar to IRP. And the long-range plan usually spans 10 years or more. The considerations to keep in mind for setting the planning horizon is making sure you have a sufficient picture for understanding the utilities plan investments over time. And, while coordination with IRP timing is an important consideration, location-specific needs are far more granular, and they're going to change on a shorter time frame, more likely than bulk power system needs. So distribution plans may need to be filed more frequently than IRPs, just a consideration. Next slide, please. And just like with integrated resource planning, stakeholder engagement is an important feature. That includes stakeholder-informed planning scenarios. For example, for different scenarios, high-low for distributed resources of different kinds, and for transportation and building electrification. The stakeholder engagement requirements before the distribution plan is filed vary quite a bit. For example, in rule, Minnesota only requires one meeting before filing. In practice, the utility holds several. Other states like Hawaii and New Hampshire make use of working groups of one or more, and that requires a significant upfront participation. Oregon explicitly included equity and justice considerations in its stakeholder engagement process, including working with community-based organizations. And then, so that was all before the filing. And then after the plan is filed, there's an opportunity for stakeholders to submit comments and for the utility to respond to them. And there are also periodic updates for stakeholders on the utility's progress on the plan. Next slide, please. So summing it up, distribution planning practices are evolving. Starting at the bottom here is the traditional focus on peak demand forecasts. And we're now including forecasts of distributed resources and considering multiple scenarios for loads and distributed resources. And moving up, the next steps after that are more formal integration of distribution planning with other types of planning, like transmission and resource planning. Routine consideration of distributed resources as non-wires alternatives, and not just when there's a distribution system need, but just looking systematically over time, trying to avoid the need for any kind of distribution investment to save money. Systematically analyzing the costs and benefits of distributed resources to determine their potential net benefits for a particular location on the system. And ultimately, there are a lot more grid services that distributed resources can provide that we're only beginning to tap, especially with storage. We have a lot of potential grid resources that can be harnessed. Next slide, please. So here are a bunch of resources if you're interested for further reading. And in the next slide is my contact information. I'd be happy to hear from you, and I'll be glad to answer questions, Amanda.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. Incredibly comprehensive presentation. We're so glad we're going to be able to post it so that everybody can get access to the information. So what we want to do with the next several minutes is seek clarifying questions. I've got 6 people, I think, that made comments in the chat. We will have a discussion following this where we're going to kind of get into the details and what you think works in the state or not. So I'd really like to concentrate on just clarifying questions or comments. So I will call you in order of the chat that was in there. So it's Tayoko, Aaron, Lauren, Margie, Darren, and then Pat. So Tayoko, do you want to mention your comment?
Yes, thank you, Amanda, and thanks, Lisa, for this a great overview. We have a regulated state, so the transmission and distribution and generation are all part of one utility, and California is deregulated. I don't know about Minnesota. How does that affect this when you have multiple players versus one player? And could you comment on that? Thank you.
Sure. So I've never moved from Oregon. So we're part of the energy imbalance market, but beyond that, we're fully integrated, even though business customers have options. So, I've lived in that integrated world. And so my presentation really was designed for New Mexico, where the utility is vertically integrated and is responsible for all the different levels of the system distribution, the bulk power system, including resources and transmission. Minnesota is also integrated, even though they're participating in MISO. So there's so many different flavors around the country. Like next door in Michigan, the utilities can't own transmission. But, so it does matter. But in the case of New Mexico, with a vertically integrated utility, everything I talked about is relevant. The differences would just be, what types of planning are relevant, right? If utilities can't own transmission, then you're not coordinating with the utilities transmission planning. But I tell you, Michigan Commission is very interested and concerned about the other resources that third-party providers can bring to bear. And that affects, the transmission picture is really important still.
Great. Let's go to Aaron. And then if you didn't put a clarifying question in the chat, but you have one, you can either raise your hand or just put on your video. So Aaron.
Hi there. Yeah, this might just be to add into the presentation later. I work for an electric cooperative, and I was wondering how many of those states require electric cooperatives to submit the same kind of information.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I can't keep track, but it's something like 10, 11 states where the State Public Utility Commission does regulate one or more electric utilities. That's also the case, rural electric co-ops, that's the case in Minnesota. And I think I mentioned, and I provide a link on one of the Minnesota slides. There's a separate order that applies to the three non-investor owned utilities, and the requirements are almost the same. They're very similar. So I guess generally, if first of all the PUC would have to regulate the rural electric co-op, regulate them to begin with for requirements to apply. But I think it's pretty rare that the state requirements, either by the legislature or the commission, apply to the co-ops. But they do in Minnesota, and that's one of the reasons I gave that example.
Thanks, Lisa. Lauren.
Yes, hi, Lisa, and thank you for your overview. It's really excellent. I made in the chat, I made a quick observation. The state-by-state comparison of various plan components was really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen, that rack up actually side by side. One of the things I noticed was many of the states in that sample required distribution system plans, but they did not require grid modernization plans. And I was curious to know, was the process essentially they established the requirement through the PUCs for distribution system plans, and then grid modernization plans followed? Or is there a logical order of, in outlining that process?
That's a really good question. That was insightful. So it's often just, what was in the legislature's bill, right? So, if or what what the commission wanted to start with, and so it's, I would say it's different everywhere, right? So but there's always a logic. So if the utility has been proposing large investments in grid modernization, whether it's advanced metering infrastructure or in a distributed energy resource management system or automated distribution, those are major investments. And sometimes the commission has said, like, look, we need a plan here. We're not just going to approve this without seeing the big picture of what's your vision, what capabilities are. So that's a very typical reason for the commission, to require grid modernization plan, or for the legislature. For the legislature, a lot of state legislators around the country are very interested in grid modernization. It is for a long time. They're very interested in bringing our systems up to, to best standards for reliability, cybersecurity, safety, all kinds of reasons, customer choice. And so that's sort of a reason. And then, the commission says, in the case of Minnesota, there was a grid modernization statute that required the utilities to make the filing. And the commission said, this is great, but we need something longer term, broader, put things in context, again, in part so that we know whether these grid modernization investments you plan to make seem reasonable in the context of planning. So it's a great question, and the story is different for every state.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. How about Margie? And you had a
Thanks,
question?
Lisa. I have a question about the same slide that Lauren just asked about. Thanks for the summary of the state by state. This one. I'm particularly interested in two things. One, sort of the source of how you put this together, and two, in particular, those states with storm hardening requirements from the perspective of energy assurance. So mostly the source and any other suggestions you have about looking for more information, particularly about the storm hardening.
So the original source of this is a report that I put together with my colleagues at Pacific Northwest Lab, and that's on the resources slide. I'm going to say 20, we could go look at the resources slide. And then we've updated it. We do training around the country on distribution system planning for public utility commissions, and also for consumer advocates, a whole host of other folks. So this particular report I'm looking is, it was 2018 report, distribution system planning, state examples by topic was where we updated it, but the original one was in 2017, state engagement, electric distribution planning. We've updated it over time. So this particular snapshot was October 2020, and then I just updated it in the last few days, just, put a few more dots on it. But it's basically hard work. That's how.
Thank you. Well, thank you for doing that.
And what was your second question? The source?
Particularly related to the storm hardening requirements.
Oh yeah, same thing. I mean, we poured through state law and requirements for each state.
Great, thank you.
And and we're not claiming that we have every single state or every requirement in every state. We're just trying to give a general picture. It's pretty accurate as of October 2020 with some additions.
Okay, let's go to Darren, please.
Hi, I'm just trying to understand a little better the drivers for some of these actions, especially in Minnesota, where distributed energy resources, at least on the customer side, are still pretty low. I mean, they're 4 times lower than New Mexico. Now, I know the sun is not quite as intense up in Minnesota since I was born and raised there, but still,
an accent.
It's a much bigger state population-wise, and they have 4 times less distributed energy generation there. What was the true driver? Because DER distributed generation in 2015 in Minnesota was pretty low. So what was the true driver for that rural development in Minnesota at the time? And is that in effect squashing further distribution? Because it doesn't seem to be accelerating it, but to any great extent.
Well, I would direct your attention to one of the resources on the one of the publications on slide 30, on the Minnesota slide, where it was the staff vision. So I think that's, they had a vision of where they wanted to go, and they already had this grid modernization requirement that utilities by statute must file the plans. And so, they wanted to understand the planned grid modernization investments in the context of broadly distribution needs, not just today, but in the future. And a lot of this is about transparency. This is my just personal view as a prior regulator. Why is integrated resource planning, transparent and stakeholder engaged, but not distribution planning when you look at the CapEx expenditures, right? Like it didn't really make, so this is, kind of a long time coming, maybe should have happened earlier. The other thing I'll mention is this kind of change is disruptive. That when I talk about this kind of change, the increase in distributed resources and these technologies that really change our world, they're not so the changes are not so incremental. They can be quite disruptive. If you think about Hawaii, which of course is very high rates, so that that really accelerated the transition. So and we have a report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation series that I'd also draw your attention to. It's actually the first couple of reports in the series where we talk about this disruptive change, including at the distribution level. So I don't want to put, I haven't read the staff report on grid mod for a couple of years because it was put out a while ago, but I would read that staff report and they tell you what their vision really was for doing this.
Thank you, Lisa. So I want to be mindful of time so we get on to the more discussion. So let's go to Pat, clarifying questions.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make sure I was synthesizing what I was hearing correctly, that just broadly, this type of planning is important. You just talked about how, maybe the investments are individually small and incremental, the impact can be large. So there's really value to doing this as an input to an IRP. And part of the observation on that question is, IRPs are already a messy bucket. This is important. So putting it in an IRP, I'm afraid could get lost. So I just wondering if you think I'm hearing that right or not.
So first of all, the investments are really big. So that's one of the key points I want to make. Like, sure, if you're, we're not really talking about like, hey, my pole is rotting, in my house and we need to replace that. We're talking about some of the big investments in, transformers are super expensive and the substations are very expensive. And so we're talking more along, those lines, and that's very expensive. Advanced metering infrastructure was the largest investment for Portland General Electric. That was one of my cases when I was at the PUC in Oregon. It was the largest distribution investment they had made in 50 years. So these are big investments that we're talking about. I think your question is like, hey, there's Nevada put it in there. They combine their distributed resources plan with the IRP. Most states are doing the distribution planning separate, and a lot of states, of course, are not vertically integrated. So there is no IRP, right? So that's a decision point for New Mexico as to whether and how to integrate the distribution plan with the integrated resource plan. But I would certainly say they should be consistent in terms of inputs and scenarios, and they should be coordinated, because it doesn't make sense to have, one thing, if you're, you would account, for example, account for the distributed resources in both plans in a similar way, and make sure you're not over procuring resources through one mechanism.
I'm going to go to Satish, and I just want to let people know Lisa has agreed to stay with us. And so there are some questions that are going to come up in the chat. So maybe Lisa, you could help address some of those in the chat. So let's go to Satish. And we can't hear you, so you're either on mute. Okay, Art, let's go to you.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you so much. It was a terrific presentation. One of the elements you talked about was in certain states, they're looking more for non-utility investment to do some of these things. And that raises the question for me is, what's in it for the utilities? How do we incentivize them to go along with these major changes? Maybe drawing on, some experience that you've had or what you've seen around the country, because you can require a plan, right? What happens after that requires either arm twisting or carrot and stick.
You raise a good point. This is all around, utility business models. So I actually don't know. There are a couple of things. One is incenting utilities. The other one is, sort of reducing barriers. So I don't recall whether your utility is decoupled or not, but that's, one consideration. Whether the utilities, revenues are decoupled from sales, retail sales. So that's an important element. There have been mechanisms tried in California. They provided an incentive for non-wires alternatives. Matt could speak to that if we had time, I think, at Tisdale. So, these days, I think there's performance-based regulation that a number of states are employing Hawaii, New York, Minnesota. That's just a partial list. And, you know, in my view, it's, you know, you can look narrowly at performance-based incentives, but as a regulator, I also want to see some parity where it's not just incentives. So you can consider multi-year rate plans that embed all of these different facets and have a stay out for the utility. So that's another mechanism that states are using. So there are a host of ways to do it. I don't know that we've landed on the perfect solution. I guess I would say it's an issue.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to boil it down and say that it's not just the technologies that are changing, it's the regulatory tools to manage this that need to change.
I think you're right. Certainly, you know, having the plan transparent is helpful when you get to the rate case. Super helpful. It's helpful for encouraging the utility to do what's in the best interest of customers. So even if you don't change, you know, the utility business model and all those regulatory tools, even having this plan transparent and stakeholder engagement is still quite useful.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we are going to move on. Lisa, you had a good comment or a good question in the chat, but I think it really goes to how do we move from where we are to where we ultimately want to be. So if we can put a pin in that and we can come back to that in the discussion. So Lisa, excellent presentation. Thanks so much. Matthew, if you want to go back to the slides, that would be helpful. So what we want to do when GridWorks was hired to help the New Mexico Commission think about grid modernization, we come in as facilitators having a certain process in mind, and the intent of the process that we're going to run through for all the webinars are to create a situation where you can engage and we can hear from you. We want you to be able to hear from others. We want to create a shared understanding and then and result in next steps. So what does this mean to the states and its utilities and stakeholders? And how does the commission put together a good rule for grid modernization? So we are going to ask you a series of questions every webinar to try to drill down and come to a common understanding. I'm not going to go through these now because you're going to hear them in just a minute. And we put the slide up there because I think I moved you through this process last time. I don't think I was super clear in my questions, so wanted to let you know what we're going to be asking you going forward. So Matthew, next slide, please. So here's what we're doing with our facilitated conversation for the next 20 minutes or so, is that we want to hear some of the opportunities and concerns that you are worried about with moving to this type of planning. And then we also want to try to come out with what are the important components that need to be included in a NOPR. We just covered so much material. We really need to triangulate on what's most important for the state. So, oh, and yeah, so we can get rid of the screen. So when you're making a comment, we'd really appreciate if people would turn on their cameras so we can have more of a dialogue as opposed to looking at names on the screen. So I wanted to ask you first, and some of you have covered a little bit of this, but we're going to ask it anyways. What did you hear that struck you? What really stood out to you in the presentation that Lisa just made? Big things, little things. And I will feel free to call on people if nobody wants to volunteer.
So I'll volunteer. I think the importance of the guiding principles and objectives that Lisa mentioned in an early slide is absolutely critical for our first conversation.
Thank you, Margie. Vice Chairman Hall? Or you just have your camera on? Yeah, you have your camera. Okay.
Yes.
Anybody?
Well, I guess I was really struck with how many states are actually doing a lot more than we are. And I'm wondering how long it took each one of them to get them in place, because, you know, I'm hopeful that we can get this rule done this year. I wonder if you could speak to that. Is this a movement that's just been something that's been recent? I know Minnesota's had their rules in place for a while, but what about the other, what about the other states?
May I address that, Amanda?
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Hall, that it varies a lot. Minnesota, initiated their inquiry into distribution planning in 2015, and they promulgated rules in 2018. And I would say they had an incredibly thorough process with many, many stakeholder meetings. And they, of course, just like your commission, had a lot going on. I certainly think that you could go faster. That was, the speed that they wanted to go through to really do the work that they wanted to do. So, Oregon took several years too, but the reason for that was just they had to sort of stop completely for a while. They had too many dockets and they had staff turnover. So, I think if you have help, right, and somewhat stable staff, you could improve upon that time. You can also do things in a phased approach. You don't have to do everything all at once. So you can, potentially promulgate an initial set of rules for some initial filings. And then even in your orders on those initial filings, you could call for improvements, just like we do with integrated resource plans. Like in your next plan, we direct the utility to do X, Y, Z. So I think, if making progress soon is important to you, then those are some options that you might consider.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
How about from PNM? What stood out to any of the folks? We've got a number of people from PNM. What stood out to you from PNM in the presentation? Mike with Excel.
Sorry,
Okay, thank you, Leslie.
I hit the video, and I'm sorry. My camera is in my office again. I don't have any comment at this point. I don't know if the other folks on the call are have any remarks.
Just anything that struck you, that surprised you or struck you during the presentation.
Nothing. I guess I'm not surprised that grid modernization is a hot topic. I have not looked at other states' grid modernization statutes, but it seemed like there was a lot of commonality among with the New Mexico statute in terms of identifying the priorities and the reasons to focus on grid modernization. Nothing. That's all.
Great, thank you. Jim?
Hi, yeah, Jim Desjardins here with Renewable Energy Industries Association of New Mexico. I guess just one thing I just wrote down is that several states require hosting capacity analysis and grid modernization. So that stood out to me.
Thank you. Anyone else? What stood out to you? Words, concepts? Jeremy?
I was struck by just the amount of money spent last year on the distribution grid. I think it was 56 million in the US.
Excellent, thank you. Jim?
I was interested in the idea of an integrated distribution plan, essentially on the same level as an integrated resource plan. It just strikes me that putting that much emphasis on it, it might depend on the level of distributed resources you have. Say with Hawaii, with that level of distributed solar, you could see that as really a necessity. However, I could see in some states where, the distributed resources, the solar is just getting started, where it might not be so important.
Great. Unless somebody else has something, I'm going to move on. So I'm trying to get your, go ahead.
Sorry, I had, let me turn on my camera here.
Yeah.
I can't can't tell if I'm on or not. But
Yeah, you are. We see you.
okay. Something that stood out to me was we were talking about how grid modernization, it supports these other areas, right? And I think for New Mexico, we're running into some overlap with our grid mod rulemaking with other rulemakings like interconnection. We're updating our interconnection rule. And then we also have a community solar rulemaking that we're doing. And I guess it's hard to parse out exactly, hard to separate out grid mod from everything else. And so I'd be interested to know, how other states have done that, how they developed it, and I guess how they looked at grid mod development impacts for all the other areas that grid mod supports.
Great. Thank you, Colin. We're not going to address this right this second. So let me move towards reflection. So what concerned you that you heard? What intrigued you? What surprised you? Trying to get your opinions about all the material that was presented and our challenge ahead to modernize the grid. Tayoko?
All right, thank you. Just I think what maybe seems challenging is the nature of my question. For example, as a business, we have certain objectives and we have certain capabilities, and if there's a lot of changes that we have to make, we're not in a place to accomplish that without learning new capability and going through this process. I realize that's what this is about right now, more of a process than a capability. But that's the concern is one, the principle that I've been following here, which is we get to 100% renewables by 2045, and in the process of all of that, somehow we have to make lots of structural changes. And what are we really good at, and what aren't we good at? And so far in my process and involvement with the Interconnect Manual and that whole discovery process about grid modern before that, it's been a challenging process. So I just have some concerns about how we can develop the real capability to achieve, the principle, the longer term goal of, 100% renewables, and how do we do it equitably and fairly and so on. So that's always at the top of my mind around this. Thanks.
Thank you. Mike.
Yes, I would, one of the concerns I think we have as utilities is make sure that this rulemaking is done thoughtfully. How do we impact customers? Planning is great, and if we get the correct rule in place, it can be really effective long-term to save customers money. But initially, these things also always seem to take more resources, so a little bit higher costs to do additional planning. And I guess I want to make sure that we're thoughtful on not impacting in-service states for customers and so on, because planning just takes more time and filings take more time. And so we've got to be sensitive to do it such that customers are not adversely impacted with line extensions, et cetera.
Thank you. Yeah. Other people that want to express some of the things that surprised you, confused you, intrigued you about Lisa's presentation? Commissioner?
So the thing I noticed I thought was interesting was the slide that showed that distribution planning can inform integrated resource planning, which can inform transmission planning. And then there was, Lisa made some comments about hosting capacity analysis, and that it was interesting to me that Minnesota law requires hosting capacity to be done. And I guess what I was wondering is, in order to do effective distribution planning, wouldn't hosting capacity be kind of a necessary early component? Lisa may have made a comment about that. I can't quite remember if that's her comment or my thought, but I would be interested to know how important hosting capacity analysis is to have the most meaningful distribution system planning you can have. Seems to me it would be really important. I think she spoke to that.
Yeah, Lisa, if you could briefly address that, that would be helpful.
Sure, Commissioner Hall. In my view, it's an important early component because they say, the two key factors that I think are driving three that are driving commissions to require utilities to file for review distribution plans are just sheer costs. Again, nationally, distribution investments, 32% of CapEx expenditures in 2021 predicted by Edison Electric Institute. Those are big numbers, and you'll see in the bar chart, the numbers are increasing. So just sheer cost. The second reason is distributed energy resources, and not just current levels, but potential for high levels and disruption unexpectedly, but also potential benefits. And so, in that regard, hosting capacity analysis is a pretty common early component. It also, you want to try to encourage where possible. You want to try to encourage developers and utility customers to put, say, solar on parts of the system that can handle it. And you also want to flag parts of the system that really can't handle it, without very expensive upgrades that the customer has to pay. And the third component, of course, is all of the grid modernization pieces to improve all of the things that the state might care about, resilience, reliability, and meeting other public policy goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Both. Yeah. So I want to move on to our third question, which relates to what insights have you had? We've heard a couple of them already, but what does this mean for us? We just went through a lot of material about how other states have addressed all these different components. So what insights have you had about how the state may be affected or your utility may be affected? Lisa, or I'm sorry, Leslie?
Oh, thank you. I actually had a question on this point, probably from Lisa or whoever might know, and that is, the Lisa's presentation was a lot about the underlying law, the underlying requirements, but what has actually been the effect of those requirements and laws in those states? That's what I think I did not see in the presentation. So I'm curious about what has come out of those processes.
So there are links. Some of them could be broken because I didn't get a chance to update all of them. But there are links on the slide on slide 23. And those do link up to actual distribution planning requirements.
Yep, and Lisa or Leslie, I think it's an excellent question. Yeah, what does it mean for us?
Right, I'm not as interested in the requirements as much as I am in what it has actually meant in terms of results.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know that that's answerable here on this webinar, but we certainly will note it because it's incredibly important.
Thank you.
Let me go to Jim.
Yes, thank you very much. Jim Desjardins here. And I think Commissioner Hall kind of alluded to this already, but it seems that there's a lot of things that other states are doing, and there's a lot more opportunity here to be proactive in planning and just in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Others want to weigh in on what insights have you had? What does all this information mean to the state, to our utilities, how we move forward? Bill with Siemens, any thoughts on that? Or Satish? Pat O'Connell?
Well, just thinking about, Leslie's question, we can definitely track through and see what the specific changes in the plan were. But just my experience having worked on IRPs, pulling this type of planning out into the public, making it more transparent, more visible, has an effect. And I think for New Mexico, that's crucially important because we're on this path to decarbonization. So it'd be nice to see how the grid services that are being considered in the grid modernization plans do or do not help get to the decarbonization goal in a most reliable, cost-effective way. And then I personally am energized by this presentation because the idea of elevating this and putting it in front of IRP is very valuable. Because if we just look at decarbonization as a bulk power question, we're missing all of the opportunities that the deeper analysis shows helps you get there. And so that's things like regional transmission, that's things like a better robust connection with load. So, that's kind of looked at in limited ways around here, like energy efficiency plans, but pulling this up, highlighting it, I think would be very valuable in terms of helping not just the utilities get to the law and their own goals, but letting the regulators and the community of people that participate in regulatory processes have better understanding so we can get this done more efficiently and faster. Hopefully it'll lead to less bogging down of the process than the more bogging down we've seen lately.
Thanks, Pat. And you've kind of bridged us into our last set of questions, which are around what needs work? What do we do next? What are the key points that we can agree on, if any, at this point? So what needs work, folks? We already heard from Leslie. We need to know, how does this, what's the outcome of doing some of this spending and investments? Arthur.
Thank you. Lisa had kind of identified the informational inputs as fundamental, and that's really a challenge here and something that we need to work on, because we're moving from black box kind of planning into open engagement kind of planning, and information access is the key. And so that's going to require, kind of like a paradigm shift in how the utilities share their information about their system in order to accomplish these goals. So that's a huge change here in this state, because we can't just make them do it, right? We have to give them the opportunity and the incentives to do it. So that for me, kind of coming from the regulatory side of it, is like the major first step challenge.
Thank you. Jim?
Yes, thank you. You asked a question like, what do we do now? And I guess from our perspective, and I'm speaking for the Renewable Energy Industry Association of New Mexico, is right now on P&M system, there's 18 closed distribution lines that we can't put any solar on, and community solar is rulemaking is in effect, and that's going to be happening. So we're looking for solutions for that. And so that's, I would say, our biggest concern is finding solutions. And hopefully we can do that in grid modernization. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And that does lead into the question, what needs to be in or not in the NOPR that the staff's going to develop?
Amanda, I wanted to just chime in, going back to Art's question about incentives. You know, if the New Mexico law says that, you know, the utilities can come in and propose, you know, projects for, you know, I think the word was certification. I need to look because I'm thinking Minnesota. And so I just want to point out the opportunity for the utility, which it could do in its own motion anyway, to be able to file a plan for a large proposed distribution system investment for grid modernization, and the commission reviewing that is a big incentive for the utility to make a filing. And if the commission believes that it needs broader context in a distribution plan, that's still a big incentive, because utilities want some sort of indication of how the commission feels about it before they make that investment. And they find out after they've installed the system or technologies in a rate case that they're not getting, you know, recovery or full recovery. So I believe that there's an incentive there. That's why utilities are on their own motion. In a lot of states in the South, they're filing grid modernization plans in Southeast without the legislature requiring them to do so, because they want to get some sort of indication from the commission about whether those costs are going to be allowed in rates. You know, and even reserving, which is a great idea, prudence determination for a rate case, that's still a lot for utilities. It's an incentive.
Thanks, Lisa. So we've got a couple more minutes to hear from folks. I want to make sure this is your opportunity on distribution system planning to give us your input about what's in and out in the rule, what concerns you, what you think we should be doing next. Commissioner?
So that reminded me of another thing that caught my attention, which is you said Minnesota required consolidated filings. So meaning the utilities all had to file at the same time, or what did that mean? Lisa, oh, this is a question to Lisa. Yeah.
Commissioner Hall, it means that instead of having a separate grid modernization report, which was required by law, and a separate integrated distribution plan, which the commission required by rule, that each utility can, well, it's just the grid mod requirement is imposed only on the largest electric utility, Xcel Energy. So Xcel Energy must file both its grid modernization plan and its distribution plan together now, which makes a lot of sense. The filings from the utilities are separate. They are not consolidated together, but for Xcel Energy, they're filing both types of plans together.
Grid mod and distribution
plan, yes.
Could you
not IRP as well?
No, the IRP is separate, but the commission a couple of weeks ago, required more coordination between the IRP and the distribution plan. So we'll see that, I think, going forward, more coordination at least.
Lisa,
so, all right, Margie,
I'm sorry to speak over you, Commissioner, but I wanted to invite Lisa to make that a little bit more material and to maybe give us an example of two things that were looked at together because of the consolidation, which would otherwise have been separate. For example, like something that is typically grid mod and something that is typically distribution planning that came before the commission together rather than separate.
You know, it's a good question, Matt, but I think one of the reasons the commission just had them put it together, required consolidated filing, is really they're not separate. A lot of what the utilities are doing, aside from replacing rotten poles and such, and looking at transformers that are, overloaded at a substation, a lot of what they're doing now They're replacing aging infrastructure that really is desperately at the end of its, useful life, and the asset health is terrible. And looking at, should we be replacing it with advanced technologies, which is grid modernization? So I think it was just the logical conclusion that, the legislature required a grid modernization plan. We're requiring distribution planning with long-term context. And a lot of distribution planning is about modernizing components, especially where we're replacing something. So I think it was just a logic.
Thanks, Lisa. Very
And
helpful.
vegetation management, for example, was mentioned. So that would be something I think of that as more in a distribution context, but.
That's correct.
So I have a follow-on question about that. I was sort of struck, and again, you may have been talking about Minnesota. I don't have complete notes, but there was a tremendous amount of information that was being required at the distribution level, I believe, by this one state. It must have been Minnesota, about the frequency of outages and where they were located, and vegetation management, and then the state of all their poles and wires. Was that just Minnesota, or is that the depth of information or the breadth of information that other states require in their distribution plan?
Yeah,
So I want to ask that you answer really briefly, because we're almost at the end of our time.
Sorry.
We have a couple of things more. It's okay, Commissioner. So Lisa, briefly.
Commissioner Hall, state requirements are always going to vary. Some states want to be more specific. Some states want to have, more general, higher level requirements. But we are seeing several other states, not just Minnesota, have very specific requirements about what they want to see, because they don't want to, have done all this work in the proceeding and then it gets a plan that really doesn't fit what they wanted to see. So they're being specific.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Margie, last comment.
Yeah, I think the NOPR should include clarity on the guiding principles and objectives, the first two level of activities that Lisa described in the what. And I'm taking a lesson from our past experience in the interconnection rule, where it's not clear to me that at the beginning that there's this broad group of stakeholders and that we're all clear on exactly where we're headed together. And I think that will streamline things if we can be clear and there's some more consensus regarding those guiding principles and objectives.
Excellent. Great way to wrap that up. Okay. So Matthew, if you would go, we want to see whether we met our objectives today. We are not having these conversations just for fun. We're trying to drive to an actual rulemaking. So our objectives were to provide overview of information and then gather your input. So hopefully we met those objectives. We're going to ask you to do this poll really quickly on a 1 to 5. And I guess, Matthew, I don't even know, is 5 the best or is 1 the best?
5 is the best.
Thank you. Yeah. So if you just fill that out, that would be great. And submit. Okay, everybody had a chance to do that.
Great, and you should be able to see the results now.
We can.
Great.
Thank
you very much for that input, folks. It means a lot to us in our quality improvement.
Okay, so we're just going to tell you what we're up to next. If you go to the next slide, please, Matthew. So we are going to have another webinar on the 17th. We're going to talk about AMI, another complicated subject. And then after that, we're going to be talking about forecasting. We will be publishing notes from comments that you gave us today. They will be on the GridWorks website, as will the recording. So if you want to go back and hear parts of Lisa's presentation or see her presentation or be able to access her links, all of that is available to the on the gridworks.org website. So that's all I have for today. Matthew, do you have any closing comments?
No, just to thank again, Lisa, for the amazing presentation and the time and expertise that went into it. We are very grateful to you, Lisa, and wishing you the best. And to everyone for engaging and for the good energy you brought here today. Bring it back again next time and add to it if you can, because this is going to be, as you can see, exciting, but also difficult. And we need your help.
And at the GridWorks website is an email for us. So if you have any comments or suggestions for me or any of the GridWorks team to make this more effective or to help you engage in more effectively, always open for suggestions to improve our process. So thank you all. Greatly appreciate your attendance today. Have a good day.
Hey, Matt and Amanda, can you stay on for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah.
Just give folks a chance to trickle off, Commissioner.
Yeah. Oh, well, we could just do a separate thing. I'd just like to chat with you for just a second.
Isaac, is it possible to disconnect?
I'm moving these folks into the, I'm moving them out. Just give me a second.
Okay.
And just the live stream is still going. So if you transfer host back, or I can just reclaim host and stop that. Give me one sec.
Great. Thank you, Isaac.